Hi, this is Zeynep Korkman, Associate Professor of Gender Studies at UCLA, and the title of my talk today is The Cunning of Pseudo-Progressive Discourses, Anti-Muslim Racism, Anti-Semitism, and Transnational Feminist Solidarity. As we speak today, our world is being shattered by colonialism, racism, and war, most acutely in the case of ongoing genocidal violence in Palestine. And in this context, critiques of anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism are getting co-opted by power holders. How should we respond? What do feminists do when anti-racist discourses in all their gender dimensions get weaponized, get fashioned to fit political agendas that are antithetical to liberation, justice, and peace? Today I speak about the politically reactionary uses of critiques of anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism in the context of colonial and national projects of rule spanning Turkey, Palestine, Israel, and the US. And I speak from a specific positionality. I speak as a scholar and citizen of Turkey. I speak as a scholar who's located in and who has recently become a citizen of US. And I speak as a social justice-oriented scholar from a Muslim Middle Eastern background, standing in solidarity with Palestine and against anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism. It is from this multiply positioned vantage point I think about the appropriations of critiques of anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism. And I think about the mobilization of these discourses to justify rather than critique racial state violence, to silence rather than assist academic and social movement critiques of state violence. And last but not the least, I speak as a feminist, and I emphasize how those reactionary forces that seek to censor and criminalize progressive critiques by falsely accusing them of being anti-Muslim or anti-Semitic are often the very same ones that seek to censor and criminalize feminist and LGBTIQ voices. This doesn't only reveal the hypocrisy of their pseudo-progressive wielding of anti-racist discourses, it also reminds us that racialized state violence and heteropatriarchal violence are co-constitutive. And retrieving our anti-racist discourses from reactionary mobilization is crucial to transnational feminist scholars and activists. In this talk, I call for analyzing pseudo-progressive appropriations of our critical discourses, whether it is critiques of anti-Semitism or of anti-Muslim racism. I call for analyzing them in their historically and geographically situated relationships to power. I push against the decontextualization that often attends to such misappropriations. Doing so, I hope, might help us move away from formulaic assignments of essentialized positions of being oppressed to monolithic categories of people such as the Muslims or the Jews. And I hope this might help us actively orient our solidarities with the so-called oppressed and remember that the oppressed are situated social and political subjects who are constantly reconstituted in relation to power. So, in my recent work, I analyze how the critiques of anti-Muslim racism travel transnationally and get mistranslated, with a focus on Turkey and the US. Turkey is a Muslim-majority country where authoritarian state secularism of the 20th century had rendered Islamic piety a sign of Easternness, backwardness, and in this context, the secular pious distinction served as a proxy to measure one's distance from the Western civilization the country wanted to join. And this distinction between secular pious also redistributed resources and power unequally amongst the citizens. The hierarchical ordering of a Western, Eastern, and secular pious distinction were brokered in gendered terms. For example, veiled women could not be considered modern or worthy citizens. And indeed, the secularist modernist project legitimized its own civilizing mission by describing it as the uplifting of women from the yoke of religion and tradition. And in this way, a kind of highly gendered race-making, distinguishing the modern and pre-modern, was accomplished through the idiom of religion. Fast-forwarding to the 21st century, progressive critiques in Turkey introduced the novel categories of white Turks and black Turks to talk about how embodied characteristics of the civilizational hierarchy operated as a form of essentialized, unassumable, race-like difference. To clarify, this is wholly distinct from, if in implicit conversation with, the racial dichotomy of white and black in the US. The term white Turks in this context denoted the secular, urban, upwardly mobile or upper-class elites in Turkey. And the term Black Turks, in contrast, denoted the religious, provincial, lower-class non-elites. The use of color in this context as the distinguishing marker signaled the essentialization of these categories like pious secular, traditional modern, Western Eastern, through their association with physical embodied characteristics, be it facial hair like beards or clothing like veils. Once this new critical discourse was in place, Black Turk identity was then appropriated by the Islamist Turkish government led by then Prime Minister and now President Erdogan and his party. And they used that discourse to garner legitimacy locally and internationally by drawing upon globally resonant critiques of anti-Black and anti-Muslim racisms. The Black Turk label helped the government to identify itself with and as the oppressed, and locally it situated the party on the side of the pious Muslims who were historically marginalized by the Turkish secularist project. And globally it situated the party on the side of Muslim peoples everywhere who were historically racialized by Western colonialism. As the 2000s and 2010s progressed, however, this appropriation came to hide several things. It covered how Muslim piety was now being transformed from an axis of oppression under an authoritarian secular state in the past to a position of proximity to state power under an authoritarian Islamist government in the present. It also covered the increasing state violence executed under his party's reign, such as the sacking of academics, judges, and other critiques of the government, the racialized killings of Kurdish civilians, and other rising violence against heterodox Muslim communities like Alevis. The underlying assertion was that if the state was on the side of Black Turks, if it defended Muslims from racism, then it couldn't also be the oppressor of racialized and otherized groups in the society. In this way, the fault lines of Turkish society were mistranslated into a black and white dichotomy. The Turkish formula specified the relationship of pious Muslim to secular Muslim as analogous to that of black to white, and this formula gained legibility globally. This mistranslation became deeply resonant in the US, thanks to post 9/11 and then later post Black Lives Matter progressive political and academic sensibilities. And this fostered unexpected affinities between some US-based feminists and the government of Turkey. For example, consider Ilhan Omar, the first Muslim woman to serve in US Congress along with Rashida Tlaib. Omar is well known for her progressive politics, and deservedly so, including her support for Palestine. She is also recognized as a feminist ally, including in the academic community, evidenced by her invitation as a keynote speaker at the National Women's Studies Association annual meeting in 2020. Yet, Omar has forged a surprising affinity with the Turkish government, which, thanks to his veneer of fighting Islamophobia, seems to have gained her sympathy. Omar met personally with President Erdogan and other Turkish officials, and accepted a donation from a US-based nonprofit lobby working on behalf of the Turkish government. Tellingly, she was the only Democratic representative to vote against the US sanctions that sought to end Turkey's invasion of Kurdish territories in Syria. She also refrained from supporting a bill that recognized the Armenian genocide and explained her position reciting Turkish foreign policy talking points. In effect, Omar ended up advocating for Erdogan government's racist and imperialist projects of violence. In other words, there is nothing essentially historically progressive about wielding a critique of anti-Muslim racism or anti-Semitism for that matter. These critiques might and do become appendices to violence and domination. This does not diminish the need to vigorously analyze and energetically organize against anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism. Rather, this means that the mere invocation of an anti-racist stance cannot unconditionally serve as a marker of legitimacy. Today, I am talking as the genocidal violence in Palestine intensifies with full US support. And I'm talking as the Turkish president holds pro-Palestinian rallies, welcomes pro-Palestinian persecuted academics in Turkish universities, and strategically aligns himself with a globally oppressed Muslimness and against anti-Muslim racism, garnering the appreciation of international progressive audiences. These important but instrumental gestures happen, however, precisely while the president mobilizes Turkish state forces for colonialist violence against racialized groups such as Kurds. Indeed, the president's pro-Palestinian posturing has served to divert attention from Turkey's strategy of military violence in Kurdish areas in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, or from its support for the genocidal violence in Artsakh. Moreover, the government's pseudo-anti-colonialist rhetoric on behalf of Palestine unabashedly draws upon neo-imperialist, and in this case neo-Ottomanist, visions of the Turkish hegemony in the region. Turkish government's gesturing as against anti-Muslim racism further embeds a framework for terrorizing dissident citizens and academics of Turkey as anti-Muslim betrayers of the nation. For example, Turkey had been busy with the mass criminalization of over 1,000 academics who had petitioned against military violence in Kurdish regions. They were then targeted as anti-Muslim, anti-Turkish betrayers, and these academics were criminally persecuted with the accusations of propagandizing in support of a terrorist organization. Such attacks were accompanied by the dismantling of proto-ethnic studies programs where minority languages like Kurdish were taught in Turkey. Not coincidentally, this came hand in hand with attacks on feminist and LGBTIQ social movements and with attacks on gender studies in the country. The government has been busy discursively pushing feminist and queer activists outside of the nation by deeming them betrayers of religion and nation, and by criminalizing them, sometimes literally as terrorists. And this was accompanied by the defunding and the institutionalization of the nascent field of gender studies. The Turkish state's weaponization of anti-Muslim racism and its feminist repercussions mirrors the American state's use of anti-Semitism, a project that uses anti-Semitism to justify supporting Israeli state violence. In declaring critiques of Israel all anti-Semitism, the US moves to silence academic and social movement critiques. In this context, the pseudo-progressive appeal of fighting anti-Semitism moves out of the frame the long-standing and ongoing colonialist violence against racialized Muslims of Palestine and beyond. And this is a violence in which the US and Israel have long been allies, of course. It also effaces the long-standing and ongoing doxing, harassment, and ousting of faculty and students by Zionist groups and by university administrations moved by them. Such brazen misuse of anti-Semitism is part and parcel of the broader attacks against critical race, feminist, and LGBTIQ initiatives, and even against diversity as such now. The effect is to further enshrine an American brand of whiteness, which continues to be deeply and violently misogynist, anti-LGBTIQ, anti-Muslim, and if ironically, anti-Semitic. So across these contexts, the weaponization of pseudo-anti-racist rhetoric by power holders have been the discursive track through which violence against racialized populations get legitimized and dissent gets silenced. Further revealing these contexts as locally specific yet deeply connected is the political and legal infrastructures through which the silencing takes shape. Critical to these reactionary endeavors has been the terrorizing of academics through anti-terror rhetoric and legislation. This rhetoric and legislation, of course, have been put into global circulation under the leadership of a post-9/11 US and its war on terror. It is worth reminding here that this globalized war on terror and attendant anti-Muslim violence have been justified as a civilizational project uplifting Muslim women and sometimes queer Muslim men from the yoke of their religion and traditions. In particular, the war on terror apparatus put in place around the world a political and legal framework in which the claims to provide support to terrorist organizations gets mobilized to target activists and academics globally. Critical academics and students get politically targeted in the parliament or the Senate, legally persecuted on charges of supporting terrorism, and investigated by university administrations. If in Turkey this looked like the government wielding charges of Islamophobia and prosecuting dissidents on charges of supporting terrorism, in the US it looked like the weaponization of anti-Semitism charges, right alongside proposed bills that would penalize students for, quote, promoting a foreign terrorist organization, end quote. Importantly, across both these contexts, Silencing of dissent happens via the transnationally circulating discursive tracks of pseudo-anti-racism and legal infrastructures of anti-terrorism. Critically, across these contexts, we remain responsible for denouncing violence committed in the name of the nation-states of which we are a citizen, and in the name of the feminist, queer, and anti-racist movements and ideas with which we identify. We remain responsible for speaking against state violence, even when it is unleashed in the name of protecting historically marginalized groups, whose members are now in a position to wield state violence against other racialized populations. Even if it is unleashed in the name of protecting women and LGBTIQ peoples, who are depicted as victims of their own societies and as in need of rescue by foreign groups, who happen to be otherwise opposed to feminist, queer, and anti-racist politics in their own countries. Importantly, in doing so, we cannot depend upon decontextualized, essentialized, identity category derivative frames, nor can we allow ourselves to be paralyzed by charges of anti-Muslim racism or anti-Semitism raised by those weaponizing pseudo-progressive rhetoric. As transnational feminists, our analyses are central to understanding the mistranslations and reactionary appropriations of our critical discourses, and central to navigating these fraught terrains. We cannot assume that anti-racist or feminist discourses will travel and translate accurately and uniformly through their travels in space and time, nor can we afford to vacate them. We are here to defend feminist and ethnic studies, which are under immediate peril in this time of re-energized attacks on academia. We are here to reclaim anti-racist and feminist discourses in this time of their misappropriation as appendices to colonialist and imperialist violence. And we recommit to understanding the many transnationally informed localized struggles we find ourselves in. We recommit to tracking the mistranslations of our progressive discourses. And we recommit to forging lines of communication and connection towards transnational feminist solidarities.